All right, let's read it all together. Ready? The Congress, louder, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution or on the application of the legislators of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes, also as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislators of 3/4 of the several states, or by the conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section. You got that? Of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the state. That 1808, that had to do with the importation of slaves. They didn't have to have an amendment because in 1807 Congress passed a law, passed a bill, signed into law that you could no longer import slaves. You have to note too that it says that the convention is for what purpose? Proposing amendments. That's all it says. It doesn't say what kind of amendments. It doesn't say what group of people will be at this convention. It just says we're proposing amendments. And also, it says that Congress can change the mode of ratification to state ratifying conventions. And it was used one other time. That was when the 21st Amendment that repealed the 18th Amendment. That was prohibition. Prohibition was the 18th Amendment, outlawing the transportation and sale of alcohol, intoxicants, and the 21st repealed that. There were a lot of, there was concern that many legislators would not have went for it, so they went along and was able to pass it by using state conventions. So a lot of times the supporters of an Article V convention like to fail to mention that. I do want to point out that there are a lot of good people who are calling for an Article V convention. One of them is a friend of mine who's been here, Mr. Dan Itza, a state rep from New Hampshire. I agree with him on almost every issue, but in this one we have definitely a disagreement. Here's a short little history of the Article V convention calls or applications. The first one, there was two, 1789. The Constitution was just ratified, and Virginia and New York were advocating one. Thankfully, people like John Hancock said, no, we don't want one, and he had a strong letter that he sent to the states to oppose it. There's been over 600 applications, probably more, maybe 700 to 800, since our nation's history. And most of the earlier ones were they would just be applications for a convention without any stated purpose. From 1890 to about 1915, applications for a convention were called for, and they had a specific reason for the direct election of senators. And again, you could put any wording in there, but the practical aspect of that is simply the application or the call, not the purpose. So once the delegates get down to the convention, they don't have to pay any attention to what the state legislators tell them to do. But we were 2 states away from a convention, and there was a big drive to have the senators elected directly by the voters, as opposed to being chosen by whom? How were senators elected before the 17th Amendment? Anybody know?
State legislature.
Oh, we have to just ask the campers. Yes.
They were,
You can stand up.
they were appointed by the Congress, well.
No, they were.
They were, but they were.
They were elected by the state legislators. They, in essence, they were almost considered ambassadors from the states to the federal government. And there was a lot more accountability. But it was the threat of a convention, because we're 2 states away. So Congress said, well, we don't want a convention because basically anything can happen, but the people won't be dumb enough to actually limit their power. No one's stupid enough. And guess what happened? States supported it. And we don't have that. You don't have the senators aren't really they don't report to the state legislators. In fact, if you call your state rep up and it was something to do with a federal or veterans issue, that's a federal issue. We have nothing to do with that. And every state legislator has to take an oath to what? To the Constitution as well as the state constitutions. That was for a good reason. No, they don't pass the buck. Anyway, so from the 1970s to the 1980s, we were 2 states away for an application for what they call a balanced budget amendment. And that sounds really good, doesn't it? Well, why would you be against a balanced budget amendment? I am in favor of a constitutional budget, not a balanced budget. A balanced budget doesn't necessarily, I'll take a question, doesn't necessarily give us a constitutional budget. How many people they budget their money? How many? Everybody does, every parent does. So what happens if you don't quite have enough money to pay the light bill or to pay the mortgage? You borrow it, don't you? You can't print it up. You can try to print it up, but it won't. See, the government can print money up. So you have to borrow it, or you sell an asset, right? That's how you balance the budget. Or you work a part-time job, or 2 full-time jobs, or you sell your timeshare down in Manhattan. So you do things to make that. Government doesn't do that. Government just prints more money, or raises taxes. That's how they do it. They don't only cut the size of government. That's what we need to do. So we were 2 states away. In 1989, Nevada legislature rescinded its application, and they used the term fraud, that the people testifying in behalf of the application were dealing in fraudulent information. So we have, from 2000 to 2010, the John Birch Society took a lead role, and probably one of the few organizations to, not just to oppose new applications, but to repeal the old applications. And a number of states rescinded. Since we're up to 32, all we need is 34, it was over a dozen states that rescinded all of their, and there were some applications going back again to the early 1700s. There were some applications for to change the Constitution to have a world government. That was back in the 1940s and 50s. There was applications. Some of them I liked as far as the motivation to have a pro-life amendment. I'd love to see that, but not through this Article V issue, Article V. 2010, this is where the most recent wave of Article V, the Article V campaign got reunited, or 2010, Harvard Law School hosted what they call a Conference on the Constitutional Convention. It's kind of humorous, though. There's one organization, that says, it's not a constitutional convention, it's a convention of states. But its founder was at this meeting, and he had no trouble with that term. The term actually is Article V, but for years the Constitutional Convention had been used, and Black's Law Dictionary describes an Article V convention as a constitutional convention. Because what are we talking about at this convention? What are we amending? We're not amending the Declaration of Independence. We're not amending the New York City phone book. We're amending the U.S. Constitution, so it's a constitutional convention. I happened to attend this event. They would not give me, or give the organization, at the time I was with the John Birch Society, they wouldn't give us they wouldn't let us be panelists. It was kind of interesting. This was, both sides are going to be represented here. It's interesting too, there's only 2 sides. You can't be against it, you can only be halfway for it. It's either you're for or against, no middle ground here. Well, we weren't allowed to, but we did get media credentialed, and I spent the day, and I had a few friends with me. I had a friend in there, sort of just getting information. We couldn't videotape inside, but outside, I was able to get one of the sponsors, a man named Larry Lessig, who is one of Obama's advisors. Now, let me ask you a question. Would you trust a convention to somebody who was an advisor to Barack Obama? No. Neither would I. Okay. And this particular man, a well-known professor, he's one of these 99 percenters. That means he's not part of the elite, right? But boy, he got invited to this thing called the Bilderberg meeting. Mr. McManus, have you been invited to the Bilderbergs?
Yes.
Dr. Kishore, have you got the invitation yet? Mr. V, have you got your invitation yet? Oh, you have. Well, okay then. But I've never been invited. In other words, this guy's an elitist if he's invited to that meeting. And he also advocated a new constitution back in the early 90s. He advocated that. I don't think I'd ally myself with a guy like that one way or the other. 2012, an organization called the Goldwater Institute promoted something called Compact for America. And anything that takes more than an hour and a half to explain, probably not going to have much success. So thankfully, they haven't had a lot of success with it. And interesting enough, Barry Goldwater, that was named after, was against an Article V. There's a group called Wolfpack. They are a left-wing organization, and they're working with other conservative organizations to promote one. And there's anyone on YouTube, there's a channel called the Young Turks. Are you familiar with that? And the man's Cenk Uygur, I know this guy. Cenk Uygur, the Holocaust denier, in this case the Turkish Holocaust denier, and he named his organization after the people that carried out that massacre in Turkey during World War I. Of course, the term Young Turks today means people that are ahead of times, but that's not why he named it that way. Anyway, from 2015 and on, there's been numerous states have introduced resolutions, Balanced Budget Amendment, and the Convention of States. That's the most influential one lately. There's a group called ALEC, that's not someone's name, that's the American Legislative Exchange Commission, and there's a lot of money behind this. There's a lot of money invested in making structural changes to the Constitution. Here are some of the arguments by pro-Article V supporters. And it's always important to get the arguments and be able to refute them. An out-of-control federal government. Well, I agree with that to some extent. That's right. But the solution is to I use the term to make the Constitution Common Core compliant. Or lower the constitutional net so everybody can be constitutionalists by slam dunking. Lower the net. Big money needs to be out of politics. Well, okay, but what about big money doesn't always win, does it? This particular man, Larry Lessig, started a PAC in New Hampshire. $2 million he gave to support. Now, he can't give it to the candidate, but they do is they spend money to go after the other people running. He still didn't win. See, the New York Yankees don't win every year the World Series, even though they have the highest payroll. So I would say big money needs to be out of a lot of things. Article V Convention cannot be a runaway. Well, that's not much of a because you say so. And let's explain what a runaway is. So the purpose of a convention, let's say, is let's sit down and let's have a balanced budget amendment. All the delegates get down there and say, we have no obligation, legally or otherwise, to obey these instructions. So we're just going to do what we want. You'll throw this out? 3/4 of the states needed to pass any proposed amendments, which would effectively stop any unreasonable amendments from being proposed. Well, isn't that a subjective term? How many people like to see the income tax repealed? You don't have to put your hand up, okay? I would say that 95, well, I don't know about that, but a lot of Americans would say that's very unreasonable. But I think it's reasonable. We had 2 unreasonable amendments that were passed 100 years ago. I mentioned the 17th, and there was the 16th Amendment, which gave us the income tax. They were passed, unreasonable amendments that were passed. And that, I think 100 years ago, we may have had more people that are a little more grounded, more solidly grounded. The media would report the event. Doesn't that make you feel comfortable? That the media is going to show up and they're going to give us a real fair shake. We're going to get all the stories. It is a remedy that the founders gave us, a gift. Actually, the founders never mentioned Article V as a remedy for a serious problem. It was simply to correct errors. If you read Madison's notes, there was nothing in there where it says, "Oh, this is as times like this." That never was the case. I believe the whole Constitution was the gift, and one of the biggest gifts one part of that gift is the Electoral College. Because if we didn't have Electoral College, there's a good chance that we would have a president that has some serious disagreements with us. States need to restore the balance of power. States have been willing accomplices in this power grab. You see, it works like this. Your state rep will say, I'm for the little guy, I'm for the tax, I'm for lower government, knowing that the federal government will give the states billions of dollars. So most states, most of the budgets, 30% of most states' budgets are paid by the federal government. So what would happen all of a sudden if the states start getting federal money from the federal government? They'd have to what? They'd have to either cut that program out, or they would have to raise taxes. And so a state rep, there was one state rep that supported a Convention of States resolution from Massachusetts. I want to have limited government. We got to clean up Washington. Then he brags about getting state money for a fireworks display in his town. We bought our own fireworks. We didn't expect the state or the town of Ringe to provide our fireworks. So here's this fiscal conservative bragging about getting money from states for the state to get fireworks. States have had conventions all the time without any problem. That is totally wrong. And see, when people say this, they say it, they just have no notion, they have no idea. I did a lot of research on that to verify that. Some states, when they had their state conventions, they rewrote their constitutions. Montana did it in 1972. New York did it in the late 60s. And Pennsylvania allowed blacks to vote up until the 1840s when they had a state convention. And at that time they said, we will no longer have blacks vote. Even when black veterans of the Revolutionary War, they were in their 90s or what have you, testified. We shed our blood and you still won't let us vote. And so they don't want to talk about that. We have over 30 states with the Republican majorities. Oh, that makes me sleep very sound at night. Oh yeah, and even if they were all constitutionalists, 2 years from now that could change. So why would you even use that? The founders generation wasn't as moral as people believe. Well, maybe they're not as moral as some believe, but I don't think they had like a 60% divorce rate. I don't think you had a high crime rate. I think we were a whole lot moral than before. And I say this, how many delegates this convention will share the worldview of our founders? 5%? 10%? 20%? I don't think I'm going to be a delegate. And I live in Massachusetts. Just the thought of delegates from Massachusetts going down wherever they hold a convention with their constitution, with our constitution in their hands on the chopping block is a frightful thing. Proposed amendments will be written in a way that cannot be misinterpreted. I think the Constitution, the way it's already written, is clear enough. Who was the President Clinton that said we don't know what the meaning of is? You see, thou shalt not. Like John McManus would also talk about the 10 Amendments. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. If we forgot anything else, you can't do that either. That's pretty clear. How clear can you get, right? This is the one that I like to refute. The Constitution is outdated and no longer valid for our times. How many people have heard that? That it was written in an agrarian society by white Eurocentric dead males or something like that, right? Well, if you looked at our Constitution, the founders had a real, they may not all have been devout Christians, but most of them were, and they realized man's innate depravity. Right. And it's because of that, they had to have limited government and lots of checks and balances. And that's what they gave us. Not just at the federal level, but at all levels. And and it's interesting too, it deals with human nature. What did King Solomon say about human nature? There's nothing new under the sun. Just because we have technology and gadgets. I was on a radio show some years ago up in Maine, and the talk show host looked like Fidel Castro's son. I mean, I'm serious. He wore the outfit, he had that khaki outfit, and he was a little bit to the left. And one of his callers called in, and he said to me, he said the Constitution is outdated and so forth. And I said, okay, let's say that I accept your premise. Which amendments do we get rid of first? How about the First Amendment that protects the right for free speech and the right to worship and petition government? He said, no, I don't think we should get rid of that one. How about the fourth one? No illegal search and seizure. How about, I think, the eighth one, no cruel and unusual punishment, the eighth one. And he said, no. I said, they used to do some nasty ways to execute people, drawing and quartering. I said, we don't do that anymore. He said, no, we shouldn't get, I said, you see, you're a victim of a cliche. You heard something you thought made sense, and then when you think it through, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then what are you going to replace it with? I had fun with this fellow. I said, so something that was written in 1787 is obsolete. What about 1848? Would that be obsolete? He said, sure, it would be. Because I know a document that was written by a Eurocentric white male in 1848. It was called the Communist Manifesto. So you want to abolish that too, which I'm in favor of doing. And he got upset because he called me a fascist and hung up. But I think I made my point. When they call you names, you're making progress. New amendments will force the federal government to obey others in the Constitution. Yes, the 28th Amendment will say you have to obey the First Amendment, and the 29th Amendment will say you have to. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So we have a people problem, not a paper problem. Mr. Reverend Kraft, does everybody obey the 10 Commandments?
What do you think?
No, so let's have a convention and add more commandments, because we have to obey them. Congress has a 6% approval, I only got a few more minutes, has a 6% approval rating. Well, we have frequent elections. Vote them out. Educate the voters. That's the best way to do it, and that's what our founders wanted. So just, I got a few minutes left. Right now, there are about 27 states with applications, live applications. Some of these, actually, we were able to get rescind a few, and we beat back a lot of new applications. So this is an important issue. If you live in any of these states, please talk to me about maybe what you can do to help prevent an Article V convention. And some good news in New Hampshire, the two resolutions that were introduced, or new applications, were tabled just a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, the one that I had introduced was also tabled to rescind, but we don't have millions of dollars. We've been outspent about 1,000 to 1. The resolution in Maine that was introduced was also tabled, and I think right now, of all the resolutions that were introduced this year, I think we're 18, we killed 18 and only 4 passed. And so we're making some progress. We just got to keep articulating the message that the Constitution isn't the problem. It's the people who are supposed to uphold it are. So thank you.